I was 8 years old when my mother, Grace, drove me along a narrow road that meandered past wheat fields and low stone walls. We were heading to a small Swabian town where my grandfather, Mr. Baxter, worked as a teacher. The distance from our home was about 30 miles, and the trip felt longer than usual because I had been restless the entire way. I kept glancing out the car window at rolling hills and scattered farmhouses. My excitement about spending time with Mr. Baxter was strong because I knew he possessed a remarkable collection of local stories. We arrived in the late afternoon, and the sunlight fell across the tidy streets of this quiet place. Old houses with steep roofs stood in rows, painted in pale colors that had begun to fade. Front yards were sometimes enclosed by wooden fences, and many of those fences needed fresh paint. People walked slowly, nodding a greeting to one another. Mr. Baxter had arranged for us to stay at his modest home, located a short distance from the small schoolhouse. I remember stepping out of the car and smelling freshly cut grass. A soft breeze stirred the air, and I felt calm as I looked around. Mr. Baxter greeted us at the door with a warm handshake and a friendly smile. He was a tall man, slightly stooped from years of leaning over desks, and he wore a light jacket despite the warm weather. He explained that the local climate could shift unexpectedly, so he preferred to keep a jacket on hand. He led us inside, where the interior smelled of old books and mild tobacco. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with volumes on folklore, history, and language studies. I immediately sensed that my grandfather's world was full of written treasures. We settled into our rooms, then sat together in the living room. Mr. Baxter prepared tea, and I listened to the gentle clinking of cups. My mother asked how he had been and whether the school was doing well. He answered that the students were diligent, though a few were prone to daydreaming. He also mentioned that some families in town had lived here for generations, carrying on age-old traditions that outsiders might find unusual. My attention sharpened at the mention of unique local customs, because I had come with a strong wish to hear interesting tales. I did not wait long before pressing him to share something unusual. Mr. Baxter smiled and promised that he would indeed tell me a story later, after a short walk. He wanted to show me part of the town before the sun set. We all stepped outside, leaving the house behind. The air had cooled slightly, so my mother wrapped a light sweater around her shoulders. We strolled down a street bordered by old oaks. Their branches hung over the road, and fallen leaves crunched under our feet, even though it was summer. Mr. Baxter explained that the trees here shed leaves in fits, possibly due to the dry conditions over recent weeks. We turned a corner and saw a house behind a sagging fence. It looked different from the surrounding homes. The paint on its walls had peeled away, exposing rough boards beneath. The windows were covered by slats of wood arranged in crossed patterns. The yard beyond the fence was overgrown with weeds and tall grass. I spotted several twisted apple trees that appeared uncared for, their limbs heavy with small, wild fruit. The sight of that property stirred a strange discomfort in me. Mr. Baxter paused in front of the fence. He let out a thoughtful sigh, then spoke in a calm tone, explaining that this neglected house was once the pride of its owner. He gestured to a rotted gate, saying that few people passed through it now. The boards looked loose, and the hinges were coated in rust. My mother and I watched him carefully, wondering why he had stopped there. He eventually told us that the occupant of this house did not venture outside during daylight. No visitors stopped by, and the condition of the building deteriorated year after year. That statement caused me to feel uneasy, despite the bright day. I knew my grandfather had a preference for collecting local legends, many of which contained frightening details. I asked if the man inside was a recluse. Mr. Baxter nodded, then mentioned that this individual was an old friend from his university days. They had once been close. Over time, something changed. Now, Mr. Baxter would not set foot in that house at all. We stood there for a moment. I stared at the boarded windows and wondered what kind of person chose to remain in darkness. The air felt still, and I sensed that something about this house was profoundly grim. Finally, my grandfather looked away and suggested we continue our walk. He turned, motioning toward a path that led beyond the outskirts of town. I followed quietly, holding my mother's hand. Although I felt safe with her and with my grandfather, my mind kept returning to the image of that abandoned residence and the unseen figure within its lonely walls. We continued down the road toward a field that stretched for about half a mile beyond the last row of houses. The sun lingered in the sky, throwing long shadows across the dusty ground. My grandfather, Meister Baxter, maintained a measured pace, occasionally pointing out local points of interest. He commented on an old chapel visible in the distance, constructed from weathered stones and lacking any modern paint. He also mentioned a disused mill that once ground grain for the entire region. I listened, waiting for him to circle back to the house with boarded windows and the individual who lived within its dim interior. We reached the edge of a wooded area. A narrow path wound between ancient oaks, and my mother hesitated, uncertain whether we should venture into the trees at dusk. Mr. Baxter assured us that the trail remained safe, even though it carried a certain gloom. He explained that local residents enjoyed strolling here on weekends, collecting wild berries in the summer, or simply enjoying the fresh air. We followed him into the shade, and the temperature dipped a bit. I walked carefully to avoid tripping on exposed roots. After several yards, Meister Baxter began to speak about the man who inhabited the neglected home. He mentioned that they had once studied together at a university in Württemberg. Both aimed to become educators. They completed their studies at the same time, and once Mr. Baxter accepted a position in this town, his friend, whose name was Michael Warren, expressed an interest in coming along. Michael hailed from a region known for its rolling hills and small cities. He often said that he wanted a quiet teaching post in a place where folklore still held meaning. My grandfather paused, glancing at my mother as though gauging how much she wished to hear. She nodded slightly, and he continued. Michael initially found lodging with a local family, but soon he rented his own house, which he later purchased. This property stood in a more cheerful state back then, painted a bright color that made it stand out from neighboring structures. The yard was once neat, and the apple trees produced so many fruits in autumn that the branches drooped under the weight. Michael embraced his new life, teaching local children in a small classroom and compiling notes on local customs. He appeared happy. We kept walking, and the path shifted upward. Loose pebbles scattered underfoot, and I concentrated on placing each step carefully. Mr. Baxter explained that Michael's devotion to regional legends grew over the years. He walked the streets, carrying a worn notebook, asking local residents about old tales. Many recognized him as an enthusiastic collector of songs and stories. Some teased him, but most regarded him with kindness. My grandfather noticed how thoroughly Michael immersed himself, sometimes to an excessive degree. We arrived at a clearing where tall grass rustled in the evening breeze. Mr. Baxter gestured toward an old stump. He used this stump as a makeshift seat during his walks and suggested that we pause for a short rest. My mother and I settled on a fallen log while my grandfather leaned against a tree. He explained that Michael, despite his friendly nature, had a blind spot. He refused to believe that the old stories might contain warnings rather than mere diversions. My grandfather tried to caution him, reminding him that local beliefs sometimes held grim truths. He went on to say that Michael seemed particularly fascinated by tales of shapeshifters, which the area's residents called werewolves or wolf people. He asked endless questions, hoping to discover the origins of these stories. Many shrugged off his inquiries, stating that such tales were ancient nonsense. A few, however, hinted that not all shapeshifter accounts were harmless folklore. My grandfather advised Michael to stay clear of individuals rumored to have shady reputations. That advice fell on deaf ears. According to Mr. Baxter, the real turning point arrived when Michael heard about a man named Wolfie, who lived in a neighboring town. Wolfie was known for his skill in crafting saddles and harnesses, and some claimed he was an excellent blacksmith. Others whispered that he was involved in questionable dealings. My grandfather always suspected Wolfie of fence-like activities. A lingering rumor cast Wolfie as a dangerous figure who might exploit anyone gullible enough to trust him. Mr. Baxter looked at me and clarified that Wolfie was not a typical resident. He had shown up in this region about 10 years earlier and kept mostly to himself. People exchanged wary glances whenever his name surfaced, but few dared confront him. Michael, on the other hand, interpreted Wolfie's isolation as evidence that he might harbor unique knowledge. He began seeking him out, bringing small offerings of spirits, hoping Wolfie would share local legends about werewolves. My grandfather warned him that it was foolish to trust such a man, but Michael seemed captivated. We rose to continue our walk. The sky had started to shift into an orange glow near the horizon, and I noticed that the birds were quieter than before. My grandfather suggested we head back, explaining that the night would soon fall. As we began our return to town, I understood that Michael's story would only become darker, and that Wolfie's presence loomed over it like a grim force. I sensed a gravity in my grandfather's tone, and even though he maintained composure, I recognized that the memory weighed heavily on him. Barely had we turned back toward the town when Mr. Baxter paused, placed one hand on a sturdy branch, and said he wanted to share more of Michael Warren's tale while the details were still clear in his mind. The air had grown cooler, and the path behind us seemed darker than before. My mother, Grace, studied Mr. Baxter's face, curious about his sudden desire to speak. I stayed close, watching the shadows lengthen. My grandfather stood firmly, indicating that he had no intention of keeping these events secret any longer. Mr. Baxter recalled how Michael had begun to spend more evenings at Wolfie's home, a place located about 2 miles from the main road. The route to that property was secluded and lined with thick brush. Michael would arrive with a bottle of strong liquor and exchange it for bits of local lore that Wolfie claimed to know. Mr. Baxter suspected that Michael's curiosity blinded him to the risks. He saw the worn notes in Michael's journal, filled with strange scribbles describing half-forgotten legends about transformation under moonlight. Over time, Michael returned later and later. He often appeared exhausted, yet he displayed a feverish excitement. He insisted that Wolfie possessed a trove of knowledge unseen in conventional books. Mr. Baxter tried to warn him, suggesting that Wolfie might twist the truth for his own amusement. Michael paid little heed. He trusted that any fragment of folklore could be valuable. He recorded every phrase, imagining a grand publication on Swabian legends. My grandfather described how Michael's eyes moved restlessly whenever he spoke about Wolfie's tales. Some hidden truth seemed to occupy his mind. Mr. Baxter also noticed changes in Michael's behavior during the daytime. Michael seemed anxious, glancing at the sky and waiting for evening. He found excuses to end conversations, claiming he needed to prepare lesson plans. In truth, he longed for his next meeting with Wolfie. Eventually, Mr. Baxter confronted him, demanding a reason for these late-night visits. Michael admitted that Wolfie had begun showing him secret practices involving old artifacts. He described bronze knives with peculiar engravings, each placed in exact sequences. Michael believed this knowledge could transform his life. One Saturday, Mr. Baxter invited Michael to a local tavern, hoping a relaxed environment would prompt honesty. They traveled a short distance by foot, covering about half a mile. The place was dimly lit, with heavy wooden tables. A few residents from the town recognized Mr. Baxter and waved. He gave them a polite nod and focused on Michael, who appeared restless. Mr. Baxter asked direct questions, pressing Michael to reveal Wolfie's true intentions. Michael avoided certain details, but he admitted that Wolfie's stories included references to savage transformations and hidden rituals. Michael insisted he felt safe, even though Wolfie often tempted him to drink far beyond his limit. Mr. Baxter grew worried. He sensed that Michael stood at the brink of something dire. He urged him to abandon these visits, reminding him of the rumors that cast Wolfie as a dangerous figure. Michael refused, insisting that Wolfie was the key to a groundbreaking exploration of local lore. Mr. Baxter then decided to speak with the authorities, but the town's law enforcement viewed Wolfie as a nuisance, not a genuine threat. They dismissed Mr. Baxter's concerns, advising him to let the matter rest. Michael continued his routine, venturing out late and returning at dawn with new notes in his journal. As the weeks passed, Michael vanished for an entire day without explanation. Mr. Baxter paced outside his home, considering every possibility. He considered driving 2 miles to Wolfie's residence, but feared an unfriendly reception. Late that evening, Michael appeared, disheveled and trembling. Mr. Baxter noticed dirt on Michael's clothes and several scratches on his arms. Michael refused to discuss what happened, muttering that he had witnessed something that exceeded his ability to understand. Mr. Baxter saw a new terror in his expression and realized that Wolfie's influence had escalated to a dangerous level. In the days that followed, Mr. Baxter quietly gathered information about Wolfie's past. He learned that Wolfie had arrived from a distant region, though no one could confirm which. Some residents whispered that Wolfie possessed unusual strength. Others believed he was skilled in forging weapons. Mr. Baxter discovered that Wolfie worked odd hours, often hammering metal under moonlight, prompting neighbors to complain about the noise. No one confronted him directly. Mr. Baxter also heard hints that Wolfie had ties to travelers known for smuggling illicit goods. The more he learned, the more he worried about Michael's involvement with this shadowy figure. That same afternoon, Mr. Baxter decided to confront Michael. He found him at home, clutching his journal. Michael's voice was unsteady, and his eyes were bloodshot. Mr. Baxter sensed a nightmare. He shut the door. Mr. Baxter stood in Michael Warren's cramped living room, taking in the clutter of books, loose papers, and the faint odor of burnt wax. Faded curtains blocked most of the fading daylight. He stepped forward cautiously. Michael was huddled near a small table stacked with handwritten pages. His shoulders were stiff, and his hands shook when he reached for a glass of water. Mr. Baxter remained silent, waiting for Michael to break the uneasy calm. After a moment, Michael cleared his throat and said that he had stumbled upon information he never should have pursued. He refused to meet Mr. Baxter's eyes. Instead, he stared at a battered notebook lying open on the table. Mr. Baxter asked him to explain. Michael drew a slow breath, confessing that Wolfie had given him glimpses of old rites connected to lunar cycles, each performed with antique knives. Michael described shapes that these knives had to form in the ground and words that accompanied each step. Meister Baxter listened, noticing how tense Michael's voice was, as though he expected something dreadful to burst through the door. Michael admitted that he had followed Wolfie into a dense stretch of forest some nights earlier, well past midnight. Wolfie had carried a sack that clinked with metal. When they reached a small clearing, Wolfie demanded silence. He placed 9 bronze blades into the earth, forming a symbol that looked more geometric than any simple circle. Michael said it glimmered under the moon, though the metal was tarnished and green in places. He tried to memorize each position, scribbling notes in a hurry. Wolfie then began to pace around the configuration, muttering a series of old words. Michael swore he did not recognize the language, yet he wrote down whatever he could recall. Mr. Baxter pressed for details. Michael hesitated, reluctant to continue. Eventually he revealed that Wolfie, standing in the center of those knives, had removed his shirt and turned his face toward the sky. A low sound emerged from him, something neither entirely human nor fully animal. Moments later, Wolfie was gone, replaced by a large wolf that raced into the blackness. Michael was left in shock, struggling to steady his breathing. He waited for what felt like hours until Wolfie returned at the edge of the clearing. By then, the shape was human again, though the memory of that transformation remained vivid. Michael believed he had seen raw proof of an ancient curse, but his curiosity outweighed his fear. The next time Wolfie left him alone, Michael attempted to replicate the ritual with those same blades. He studied the positions, trying to insert each knife into the soil in the exact manner. That was the night he vanished, lost in the woods for an entire day. He confessed that his attempt succeeded only partially. Parts of him changed just enough to terrify him. His senses grew sharper and his limbs felt disjointed. He crawled in confusion until the first hint of morning, then reversed enough of the process to regain most of his human form. But something went wrong. He realized that a piece of the transformation would not revert. He hinted that his leg was altered, though he did not reveal how. Mr. Baxter felt a chill run down his back. He asked if Michael had considered seeking medical help. Michael shook his head violently. He said no physician would grasp what had happened. They would lock him away as a curiosity or report him to the authorities. Michael then lifted the hem of his trouser, just enough for Mr. Baxter to see a section of fur covering his ankle. His foot, twisted in shape, bore the hallmarks of a wolf's paw. Meister Baxter stepped back involuntarily, swallowing hard. He had never imagined such a thing to be possible. Michael insisted that Wolfie had planned this from the start, leaving those blades in easy reach and allowing Michael to witness the ritual. Now that Michael had tampered with forces he barely understood, he faced permanent consequences. He clutched his notebook and asked Mr. Baxter to promise not to speak of it to anyone. He believed that Wolfie would come for him, seeing him as a rival or an intruder upon sacred ground. Mr. Baxter said they should seek help from townspeople, yet Michael laughed bitterly. No one would believe them, and if anyone did, they would recoil in horror. In the end, Mr. Baxter left Michael's house with a heavy dread. He walked down the short path to the street, noticing how the lamps had begun to glow in the evening gloom. He resolved to confront Wolfie himself, even though the notion filled him with uncertainty. As he reached the old oak near the corner, he glanced back at Michael's house. Through a gap in the curtains, he saw a single light burning. He had never known Michael to look so isolated, trapped within his own body and tormented by a bizarre fate. Meister Baxter walked to his home along a narrow side street. He kept looking over his shoulder, as though he expected someone to step out of the dusk. The events of the day weighed on his mind, and he knew he had a decision to make. Michael had revealed more than enough to leave no doubt about the seriousness of his condition. Mr. Baxter resolved to gather facts and confront Wolfie, but he also realized he needed a plan. He entered his modest house and locked the door behind him. Inside, he found the lamp burning on the wooden desk where he usually graded papers. He set his bag aside, removed his jacket, and sat down. For several minutes, he stared at a blank piece of paper, considering how best to proceed. He scratched out a rough outline of possible steps. First, he would confirm if Wolfie was still living in that run-down building 2 miles away. Second, he would speak to at least one individual in town who might hold information about Wolfie's daily routine. Third, if Wolfie proved unreachable, Meister Baxter would search the forest clearing that Michael had described. Although the idea unsettled him, he suspected that no one else would dare. Early the next morning, Meister Baxter prepared to leave. He slipped on sturdy boots and a heavier coat. The weather had changed overnight, bringing a mild chill. He placed a small notebook and a pen in his coat pocket, along with a flashlight. He decided not to carry any obvious weapon, fearing that such a move might invite suspicion. He opened the door to find a gray sky and a light drizzle. The streets were quiet, with few signs of activity. He walked toward the heart of town, passing a bakery with warm lights inside. The aroma of fresh bread drifted through the doorway. He paused briefly, debating whether to buy something to take on the road. Then he continued, feeling too uneasy to enjoy breakfast. After another 100 yards, he reached a modest house belonging to an older resident named Mr. Snyder. This man occasionally performed minor repairs at the local school, and he had a habit of wandering the countryside for hunting or gathering firewood. Mr. Baxter believed that Mr. Snyder might know Wolfie's comings and goings. Mr. Baxter knocked on the door, and Mr. Snyder opened it. The older resident gave a small nod, then let Mr. Baxter enter. They greeted each other politely. Mr. Snyder was a short man with thin hair and a guarded expression. He listened quietly when Mr. Baxter asked if he had noticed Wolfie in recent days. Mr. Snyder answered in a low voice, indicating that Wolfie rarely stayed in the same spot for long. He had last seen him 2 nights earlier, heading west on a narrow path beyond the outskirts of the neighboring town. Mr. Baxter pressed for more details, and Mr. Snyder admitted he had observed Wolfie carrying a burlap sack over one shoulder. No one else walked beside him. Mr. Snyder could not say where Wolfie was headed, but he guessed Wolfie might be heading toward the woodland behind the old mill, about a mile from the last house on that route. Meister Baxter thanked Mr. Snyder for sharing what little information he had, then left, feeling uneasy. He walked along the main road that led out of town. The drizzle continued, making the road slick. The damp air carried the scent of wet leaves and soil. Mr. Baxter passed a few scattered houses, each set back from the road by about 20 feet of yard. People inside their homes might have seen him walking by, but they did not emerge. He followed the road for a mile, scanning the edges for any sign of Wolfie. He saw only empty fields and occasional stands of trees. Eventually, Meister Baxter reached a spot where the road split. One branch continued west, while the other veered north. He believed Wolfie was more likely to travel west, since that path led to the old mill. Meister Baxter decided to proceed in that direction. Meister Baxter left the fork in the road behind him and walked west along a dirt track that paralleled a shallow stream. The drizzle turned into a steadier rain, and he flipped up his coat collar, shielding his neck. The narrow path became slippery, dotted with puddles that reflected the dull gray sky. He spotted leaning fence posts on his right and the remains of an abandoned stable to his left. He moved slowly, scanning the horizon for any sign of another traveler. Ahead, the dirt track approached a short wooden bridge that arched over the creek. The boards on that bridge looked warped and perhaps dangerous, so Meister Baxter tested each plank before taking the next step. Rainwater trickled through the gaps and his footsteps sounded hollow. On the other side, the road continued between rows of birch trees. Their pale bark streaked dark with moisture. He brushed aside low branches that hung over the track, soaking his sleeves. He reached an old mill foundation about half a mile from the bridge. The structure was mostly collapsed, the roof torn away by storms in previous years. He circled the site, noting a scattered pile of broken stones and rotted timbers. A tall brick chimney stood near the center, blackened by decades of use when the mill had been active. He paused to look for footprints, but the wet ground revealed only a messy tangle of impressions from the rain. He called out once, uncertain if anyone might linger in the shadows. His voice vanished into the surrounding silence. He checked the broken doorway that led into a chamber with a dirt floor. Inside, the ceiling beams were missing, and the corners were choked with tall weeds. He saw scraps of rusted metal that might have been components of the mill's machinery. A single wooden bench lay on its side, half buried in debris. Mr. Baxter examined the area for recent signs of human presence, but found none. Unsure where else to look, he retraced his steps, walking around the perimeter of the site. A small path led away from the mill, winding into a group of twisted trees. He followed it for 20 yards until the undergrowth thickened. There he noticed fresh scuff marks on the damp ground, suggesting that boots had pressed into the mud. He crouched, running a hand across the disrupted soil, confirming that someone had indeed passed through. He pushed forward, holding branches aside. The rain eased slightly, though droplets still fell at a steady rhythm. The path dipped, revealing a shallow gully. At the base, a cluster of moss-covered stones formed a sort of natural arch. Under this arch, the ground remained relatively dry, and he spotted footprints more clearly. They seemed large and widely spaced, as though made by someone with a long stride. The prints angled toward a thicket beyond the gully. Mr. Baxter resisted the impulse to hurry, instead placing each foot carefully to avoid slipping. He felt his heart pounding. Each detail in the landscape appeared unnervingly clear. The smell of wet soil, the drip of water from leaves, and the slight rustle whenever he brushed against shrubs. He stopped when he saw a single piece of torn cloth snagged on a low branch. He picked it up, noticing a dull greenish hue. He wondered if it belonged to Wolfie, but he had no proof. He slipped it into his pocket, thinking that he might need it later. The gully curved, leading to an area where the trees gave way to a more open stretch of land. There, the ground sloped upward. Beyond that slope, he caught sight of a faint column of smoke rising above the tree line. It was thin and difficult to see in the gray air, yet it drew him onward. He climbed with care, pausing every few steps to steady himself on exposed roots. The soil was soft, and he slipped more than once, nearly losing his footing on the muddy incline. At the top, he discovered a clearing. A crude shelter built of logs and branches stood close to an ancient oak. Smoke curled from a rudimentary stone pit in front of that shelter. Meister Baxter crouched behind a dense clump of bushes, surveying the site. He saw no movement. The fire glowed faintly, producing more smoke than flame. Shards of cut wood lay scattered, and a few metallic glints caught his eye near the entrance, possibly tools or scraps of iron. He took a breath and stepped into the clearing, announcing his presence by calling out for Wolfie. No answer arrived. He edged closer to the shelter, noting the worn footprints around the smoldering pit. There, he spotted something on the ground. An abandoned burlap sack. The damp fabric bore dark stains, though he could not determine their nature. Mr. Baxter nudged it with the tip of his boot, bracing himself for an unpleasant discovery, but the sack felt empty. He glanced around, searching for footprints leading away from the shelter. He found them heading deeper into the woods to the north. They looked recent, the prints sharply defined in soft earth. Sensing that he might be close to confrontation, Mr. Baxter steadied his nerves. He decided that if Wolfie was here, perhaps lurking among the trees, he had to face him. He lifted the flashlight from his coat and gripped it firmly. Then, with each careful step, he advanced into the denser part of the forest, determined to find answers before the day's light vanished. Mr. Baxter advanced into the denser woods, leaving the crude shelter and smoldering fire behind. The rain had tapered off, replaced by a mist that clung to the undergrowth. Each step required caution because the damp leaves underfoot concealed uneven ground. He gripped the flashlight, ready to switch it on if the gloom thickened. The air smelled of wet bark and decaying foliage. Occasional droplets fell from branches overhead, tapping his shoulders. He followed the fresh footprints which veered around clusters of low shrubs. At times the tracks faded when the ground turned rocky, but he found them again where the soil softened. As he moved deeper, the forest canopy grew tighter, blocking the limited daylight. An uneasy quiet reigned, broken only by distant drips of water and the faint rustle of small creatures. Mr. Baxter thought about Michael, alone in that dilapidated house with his affliction. He also considered the risk he was taking by seeking Wolfie here, in an unfamiliar part of the woods. After about 200 yards, the ground sloped downward into a shallow hollow. Dark water pooled at the base, forming a stagnant puddle surrounded by twisted tree roots. The footprints skirted the perimeter, suggesting that whoever made them was careful to avoid the boggy center. Mr. Baxter did the same, picking his way around fallen limbs. Near the far edge of the hollow, he noticed a set of fresh boot marks. They were impressed at a diagonal angle, indicating a person crossing quickly. He wondered if Wolfie had noticed he was being followed. He checked his watch. Late morning had arrived, though the dim light made it seem later in the day. He reminded himself that he had promised his family he would return by nightfall. He paused, considered retreating, then pushed onward. He reasoned that he might not get another chance to track Wolfie. Michael's fate hung in the balance, and the knowledge of his partial transformation weighed on Mr. Baxter's thoughts. He continued into a darkened corridor of pines that formed a narrow passage. The trunks stood close together, their branches overhead creating a tunnel-like effect. He walked carefully, brushing aside needles. Partway through, he caught a glimpse of movement on his left. He froze, heart thudding. The movement ceased. He peered between the trunks. Nothing emerged. He decided to speak calmly, addressing Wolfie by name in a measured tone. No response arrived. The forest returned to its heavy silence, and he resumed walking. Shortly after, he reached a small clearing with patches of moss covering old stones. A thin sapling stood in the center, its leaves dotted with droplets. He spotted footprints circling this sapling, then veering off to the right. He turned in that direction, hearing a slight shift in the underbrush nearby. His nerves tensed, but he forced himself to remain steady. Even if Wolfie waited in the shadows, Mr. Baxter had come to speak, not to fight. He called out again. This time, a figure emerged from behind a broad oak about 10 yards away. The man wore a dark coat and stood with a slight stoop. His hair was unkempt, and his facial features were partially hidden by a few days' growth of beard. Meister Baxter recognized the intense look that matched the rumors. He realized that Wolfie had been observing him for some time. Mr. Baxter announced that he was a teacher from the nearby town, that he knew Michael Warren, and that he needed a solution to Michael's plight. Wolfie regarded him without visible alarm. His posture was guarded, though he did not advance. Meister Baxter waited, noticing Wolfie's hands remained at his sides, unclenched. After a few moments, Wolfie asked why Mr. Baxter had come alone. Mr. Baxter replied in a calm manner, explaining that he wished to avoid drawing attention to this matter. The tension in the clearing felt thick, though no open threat was made. Wolfie stepped closer, closing the distance to about 5 yards. Mr. Baxter saw a faint scar on Wolfie's left cheek. He remembered the rumors about Wolfie's prowess with metalwork, the suggestions that he might craft items not intended for honest use. Mr. Baxter refrained from making accusations. Instead, he asked if Wolfie possessed a method to reverse Michael's condition. Wolfie's expression did not soften, but he did not dismiss the question either. He said that Michael meddled with rites older than modern understanding, and that no one forced him to do so. Mr. Baxter kept his voice steady, insisting that Michael had made a mistake, that he had not grasped the full consequences. Wolfie pointed out that ignorance did not remove responsibility. Mr. Baxter pleaded for a way to restore Michael fully, emphasizing that this curse was not beyond remedy if Wolfie had any knowledge of such matters. Wolfie replied that altering the ritual again carried great danger. He observed that the blades were key, that the incantations needed to be precise, and that any small error could make things worse. Mr. Baxter maintained his composure. He said Michael was prepared to risk everything if it meant becoming human again. Wolfie looked at him in silence, then glanced toward the pines. Mr. Baxter sensed that Wolfie had not fully refused. He asked whether Wolfie would meet Michael in person, show him the proper sequence, and allow him a chance at normal life. Wolfie exhaled and said that if Mr. Baxter dared to help Michael repeat the ritual in full, there was a single night to attempt it safely. That night was approaching soon. Night approached, and a faint crescent moon rose above the tree line. Mr. Baxter returned to Michael Warren's house with Wolfie walking a short distance behind. They had agreed to attempt the proper sequence of the ritual so that Michael could regain his normal form. Inside the dimly lit interior, Michael stood waiting in the narrow hallway. He wore a long coat, concealing the partial deformity that plagued him. Wolfie stepped forward and set a bundle of bronze blades on a wooden table. Meister Baxter switched on a small lamp, revealing the tarnished edges of the knives. Michael braced himself against the wall. He described the clearing where he had first tried the ritual. Wolfie nodded, affirming that the place needed to be free of nearby dwellings. Mr. Baxter sensed anxiety in the cramped room, though nobody gave voice to their apprehension. They assembled the knives carefully, ensuring that each was accounted for. Wolfie explained that the blades must be placed in the earth according to their markings. They departed before midnight, traveling by foot across a muddy path that cut behind the overgrown gardens. Meister Baxter carried a flashlight. Michael brought his worn notebook, and Wolfie moved with deliberate steps. The sky remained clouded, blocking most starlight. Meister Baxter observed how Michael limped slightly, favoring his human leg. The other foot was wrapped with cloth, but he could see the outline of something misshapen. They reached the old trail leading into the forest, the same path Michael recalled from his previous mistake. Wolfie directed them deeper, instructing them to remain quiet. The ground glistened from the day's rain, and their steps created dull, squelching sounds. No one else appeared to be out at this hour. They arrived at a clearing where damp grass covered a circular patch of ground, ringed by leaning pines. The moonlight filtered through thin clouds, giving enough visibility to proceed. Wolfie knelt in the center, arranging the 9 bronze blades in a precise pattern that resembled a spiral with branching lines. He took his time, measuring the distance between each point by counting paces. Michael stood close, gripping his notebook, prepared to jot down corrections if needed. Meister Baxter remained on the edge of the clearing, playing the flashlight across the area to ensure no hidden threats lingered. The air smelled of damp bark and rotting leaves. When Wolfie finished placing the blades, he stepped back and told Michael to enter the spiral. Michael swallowed hard and moved into position. Wolfie instructed him to remove the makeshift bandage around his foot. Michael hesitated, then unwrapped the cloth, revealing the partial fur and uneven shape of his lower leg. A light tremor passed over him. Mr. Baxter waited at the perimeter, uncertain whether to intervene. Michael recited the phrases that Wolfie provided, stumbling occasionally on the unfamiliar words. Wolfie corrected him quietly, ensuring that each syllable matched the required sound. Mr. Baxter observed the tension around them. A slight breeze rustled the pine needles overhead. The moon vanished behind a thicker cluster of clouds, causing the clearing to dim. Suddenly, a movement at the far side of the clearing caught Mr. Baxter's eye. At first, he assumed it might be a fox or a stray dog. He raised the flashlight beam. An amber reflection glowed, revealing 2 eyes set close together. The figure advanced with a low sound, neither a growl nor a hiss, but something primal. Mr. Baxter saw its outline, a powerful creature on 4 limbs, bristling fur along its back, and a muzzle that pointed directly at the group. Wolfie turned sharply, realizing the danger. Michael, in the center of the spiral, froze. The unknown werewolf lunged into the clearing, moving with alarming speed. Meister Baxter thrust the flashlight beam forward, but the creature avoided the glare by shifting sideways. It collided with Wolfie, sending him sliding across the wet grass. Wolfie rolled onto a knee, struggling to regain balance. The werewolf loomed, snapping its jaws. Mr. Baxter rushed to help. He grabbed a fallen branch, roughly 2 feet in length, and approached the creature. It swung its head, and he glimpsed a streak of dark fur matted with old scars. Its breath emerged in ragged bursts, creating a pungent smell of unwashed hide. Wolfie recovered enough to stand, stepping between Mr. Baxter and the attacking shape. The unknown werewolf snarled again, attempting to lunge closer. Michael remained trapped in the center, uncertain if leaving the spiral would worsen his condition. Wolfie shouted for him to keep reciting, to hold his focus on the words. Michael's voice trembled, but he resumed the incantation. Meister Baxter and Wolfie circled the beast, forcing it to shift its attention between them. It lunged at Wolfie a second time, slashing with claws, but Wolfie dodged, swiping at it with a short blade he pulled from his coat. The creature leapt backward, then turned on Mr. Baxter, who held the branch tightly. The werewolf pounced, aiming to knock Mr. Baxter to the ground. He sidestepped, stumbling but managing to maintain balance. Wolfie took advantage of its distraction, landing a blow that caused a sharp yelp. The beast twitched, staggering at the edge of the clearing. Wolfie gave a warning look to Mr. Baxter, then lunged forward again, driving the werewolf away from the spiral's center. The creature growled in frustration, then bolted into the surrounding trees, snapping branches in its haste to flee. Mr. Baxter panted, unsure if it would return. Wolfie scanned the tree line but saw no further movement. Michael continued chanting, determined to finalize the ritual despite the chaos. The clearing lay silent except for the rustle of leaves. A low moan echoed through the pines as Michael continued the incantation. His voice shook, but the syllables came in a steady flow, each line a careful echo of what Wolfie had taught him. Wolfie, still scanning the forest perimeter, nodded once, encouraging him to keep going. Mr. Baxter stood close by, branch in hand, breathing heavily from the scuffle. Damp leaves clung to his coat and shoes. The unknown werewolf had disappeared into the undergrowth, but the tension remained thick in the clearing. Time seemed to stretch as Michael's chanting reached a second phase. Wolfie signaled him to alter his stance. Michael gently stepped over one of the bronze blades, repositioning himself at the spiral's heart. He glanced at his twisted foot, half covered in wiry fur, and forced himself to focus on the ritual. Wolfie took the small blade from his coat again, checking for any sign of that lurking beast. Meister Baxter circled the clearing's edge, flashlight aimed outward. The night air felt colder now, as though the forest resented their presence. Above, the moon remained hidden behind cloud layers. A faint breeze set the pines swaying, creating a shifting pattern of shadows on the ground. Michael's voice rose and a subtle shimmer passed over the bronze knives. Meister Baxter caught the faint glint in his flashlight beam. The metal seemed to come alive, almost pulsing with each phrase. He exchanged a look with Wolfie, who narrowed his eyes, watching for the precise moment to intervene. Michael paused, pulling in a ragged breath. He consulted his battered notebook with trembling fingers, verifying the final lines. Wolfie murmured that the last part of the incantation required an unwavering will. If Michael hesitated, the entire attempt might fail. Meister Baxter offered a few words of encouragement, careful not to disrupt the pattern. Wolfie reminded them that everything depended on accuracy. One misplaced blade, one incorrect syllable, and the transformation might lock in place forever. Michael renewed the chanting, each word pronounced with clearer intent. His body trembled, and the partial fur on his leg seemed to shift. Meister Baxter noticed subtle pops, as if bones were aligning under the flesh. Wolfie's stance shifted, like a guard anticipating attack. Moments ticked by in suspended dread. The pines overhead groaned under the breeze. Suddenly, from the far side of the clearing, a guttural snarl cut through the gloom. The unknown werewolf lunged back into view, moving low and swift. It seemed enraged by the ritual's energy, as if the shifting currents drew it like a beacon. Mr. Baxter swung the flashlight beam, momentarily catching the creature's savage features. Wolfie jumped forward, meeting it before it could reach the spiral. The two collided in a burst of force. Wolfie slashed with the short blade, catching fur and flesh. The beast snapped back, staggering but not retreating. Michael's chanting faltered for an instant, his concentration shaken by the violent clash. Mr. Baxter rushed to his side, urging him to remain steady. Wolfie grappled with the intruder, forcing it away from the circle of knives. The creature's jaws clamped onto Wolfie's sleeve, tearing the fabric. Wolfie struck again, landing a blow that made the beast recoil. It stumbled backward, eyes reflecting a fierce glow in the dim light. Michael clenched his teeth, forcing himself to stay inside the spiral. He resumed the words, voice carrying new resolve. The bronze knives flickered. Meister Baxter saw Wolfie press the advantage, maneuvering the other werewolf farther from the circle. An eerie hush fell around them, broken only by labored breathing and low snarls. The final lines of the incantation spilled from Michael's lips. With a last flicker of the blades, the spiral brightened. A ripple coursed through the air as though reality itself quivered. Michael gasped, his posture crumpling for a heartbeat. Then he braced himself, exhaling painfully. His twisted foot began to revert, the fur receding. He let out a strangled sound, half relief, half agony. Joints cracked, shifting back to a more human form. Mr. Baxter placed a steadying hand on Michael's shoulder, watching the transformation resolve. Under his torn pant leg, Michael's flesh now looked human, though bruised and raw. Wolfie forced the unknown werewolf to the tree line. For an instant the beast hesitated, as if debating whether to continue the fight. Wolfie brandished the blade, panting. Finally, the creature issued a frustrated snarl and turned, vanishing among the dense trunks. The clearing lay still except for the swirl of leftover energy from the completed ritual. Michael nearly collapsed, and Mr. Baxter helped him remain upright. Wolfie approached, breathing in ragged bursts. His coat sleeve hung in shreds, but he appeared uninjured. He surveyed Michael's bare foot, confirming that the hair and claws were gone. Everyone stood there in stunned silence, the tension in the air shifting into a heavy relief. Wolfie knelt, collecting the bronze blades. He said that any further attempts would be too dangerous to perform here. Michael's eyes filled with exhausted gratitude. Mr. Baxter let out a long exhale, thankful that Michael had escaped a worse fate. Though the dangers of the night remained, this moment carried an unspoken sense of triumph. They stood on the clearing's edge, breathing in the aftermath of the ritual and the sudden confrontation. Michael steadied himself against Mr. Baxter, carefully testing the ground with his restored foot. Wolfie, clutching the bundle of bronze blades, watched the shadows for any sign that the intruder might return. A faint glow from the newly exposed moon cast thin beams through shifting clouds. The wind rustled in the pines, stirring up a lingering tension that refused to disperse. Wolfie spoke first, his voice low. He explained that the werewolf who attacked was not a mindless monster but another victim of the same hidden practices that once trapped Michael. Some individuals, he revealed, drifted off the beaten path, seeking power in these ancient transformations. Others stumbled into them by chance. Over time, many lost the last remnants of their human identity. Once they fell fully under the curse, they grew hostile toward any attempt to break those spells, as though the ritual's energy threatened their own bitter existence. Michael's breath caught at this revelation. He asked if the werewolf had once been a person like him, somebody who tried a ritual without proper guidance. Wolfie nodded, confirming that not everyone could be saved. Some, after years of half-living under moonlight, lashed out at anything that offered hope of deliverance. That was why the unknown werewolf prowled these woods, attacking at precisely the moment Michael sought to rid himself of the curse. The savage creature might have recognized the flicker of redemption and fought to extinguish it. Mr. Baxter felt the hair on his arms stand on end. He realized that Michael had only narrowly escaped sharing that same fate. Wolfie, noticing the fatigue weighing on both teacher and friend, suggested that they leave before the intruder grew desperate enough to return. They gathered the bronze blades, mindful of how potent they truly were, and slipped back through the forest. Every few yards, Mr. Baxter turned to scan the dark. He saw no trace of glowing eyes or stirring undergrowth. It took them nearly half an hour to retrace their path. The mud squished beneath their boots, and drips of water fell intermittently from swaying pine branches. Wolfie led, weaving a route that skirted the thicker undergrowth, allowing Michael some relief as he struggled to walk on a leg still achy from recent changes. Mr. Baxter kept the flashlight trained on the trail, picking out stones or exposed roots to avoid. By the time they reached the edge of town, the moon had slipped behind another bank of clouds. Michael's house stood silent and dreary in the distance, its window slats casting faint outlines in the gloom. Wolfie stopped near an old fence, turning to address Michael and Mr. Baxter. He handed over the bundle of knives, instructing them to store the blades safely, far from prying eyes. The risk of letting them fall into the wrong hands was too great. Michael thanked Wolfie in a halting manner, still grappling with relief at having his body whole again. Wolfie reminded him that no ritual was ever without consequence. He urged Michael to be vigilant. If he felt any lingering effects, dreams, unusual cravings, or fits of restlessness, he should seek help immediately. Michael nodded, promising to heed the warning. Wolfie inclined his head politely to Mr. Baxter, then slipped away, vanishing into the deeper shadows at the perimeter of the sleeping town. Michael and Mr. Baxter stood there, listening to the creak of an old oak overhead. At last they resumed their journey, entering the yard and stepping into the house with quiet relief. Inside, Mr. Baxter insisted that Michael rest. He helped him settle in a chair near the small wood stove, where the faint warmth soothed stiff muscles. Michael dozed off, still clutching the old notebook. Mr. Baxter placed the bronze blades inside a locked wooden box, then removed his coat. The night's events had pushed him beyond normal fatigue. He sat at the table, stared at the quiet form of Michael, and thought of how fate had led them through a labyrinth of secrets. Wolfie's hints about the unknown werewolf sank into his thoughts. That poor soul might once have been an earnest researcher, a traveler, or a hapless local citizen who stumbled upon the same temptation. Now, twisted by years under the moon, it roamed the forest, attacking anyone who threatened its private misery. Yet there was a glimmer of solace. Michael was safe. His leg was human again, and if he stayed vigilant, he could reclaim a normal life. Mr. Baxter resolved to keep an eye on him, helping him resist any lingering pull of ancient enchantments. Many years later, I, the 8-year-old boy who had arrived to visit Mr. Baxter that summer, listened to his story with rapt attention. We were back in his cozy living room. A kettle simmered on the stove, and a half-read textbook lay open on the desk. My grandfather's voice, though steady, carried the weight of bygone fears. He looked at me with a serious expression, concluding his account of Michael Warren and the fateful confrontation with that unnamed werewolf. He said that after those events, rumors spread through town. Some residents whispered of nightly howls near Old Orchard lands. Others claimed to have glimpsed a hulking shape by the creek at sundown. But no further attacks occurred. Wolfie himself departed soon after, leaving no word of where he'd gone. Michael continued teaching for some time, though he remained reclusive, rarely venturing out after dusk. My grandfather finished by reminding me that the world is wide and that genuine wonder sometimes walks a fragile line between discovery and danger. He wanted me to understand that monsters could wear many faces, and that sometimes the darkest stories hold kernels of truth. Then he laid his hand gently on mine, smiled in a tired way, and said that was all he had to tell. I stared at the fading light beyond his window, imagining that lonely house with boarded windows and the quiet occupant inside, aware that I would carry his story with me, wherever I went in the years to come.